In the summer of 1940, the streets of Berlin were awash with euphoria that bordered on hysteria. German troops were marching beneath the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. The British army had been cast into the sea at Dunkirk, and the continent of Europe, from the fjords of Norway to the Pyrenees, lay under the shadow of the swastika. To the average citizen, and indeed to the military leadership, it appeared that the war was already won. The Wehrmacht seemed to be an unstoppable juggernaut, a machine of war so precise and overwhelming that no nation could stand against it. But beneath the polished boots and the newsreel footage of endless tank columns, there was a fatal crack in the foundation. The German war machine was not broken on the frozen steppes of Russia or the beaches of Normandy. It was broken here, in the moment of its greatest triumph, by a decision to turn off the engine just when it needed to speed up. If you are fascinated by the economic and industrial secrets that determine the rise and fall of empires, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications, because we are about to dismantle the myth of German efficiency. To understand the magnitude of this error, we have to look inside the mind of Adolf Hitler in late 1940. He was a man obsessed with the trauma of 1918. He believed that Imperial Germany had not been defeated on the battlefield, but had been stabbed in the back by a home front that collapsed under the strain of hunger and deprivation. He was terrified that if he asked the German people to sacrifice too much, if he rationed their butter, took away their luxury goods, or forced their wives into factories, morale would crumble and his regime would fall. This fear drove the strategic philosophy of the Blitzkrieg. We often think of Blitzkrieg as a military tactic, tanks and planes moving fast, but it was primarily an economic strategy. It was designed to win wars quickly and cheaply, allowing Germany to plunder the resources of its neighbors without stressing its own economy. It was a strategy of a gambler who brings only enough chips for one hand of poker, expecting to win the pot immediately. In the aftermath of the French campaign, this philosophy led to a decision that seems insane in hindsight. Convinced that Britain would sue for peace and that the upcoming invasion of the Soviet Union would be a mere sandbox exercise lasting no more than 8 weeks, Hitler ordered a reduction in armaments production. Yes, you heard that correctly. In the middle of a world war, the German leadership actually downshifted their industrial output. They initiated what was known as a Rüstungsurlaub, an armaments holiday. Soldiers were demobilized and sent back to civilian jobs. Factories that had been churning out artillery shells were retooled to produce consumer goods. The logic was that the stockpiles of weapons captured from the French and British were sufficient to equip the Wehrmacht for any future campaigns. It was supreme arrogance masquerading as economic policy. While Germany was effectively taking a vacation, its enemies were waking up. Across the Channel, Winston Churchill was mobilizing every scrap of British industry for a total war survival. In the East, Joseph Stalin was ruthlessly industrializing the Soviet Union, moving entire cities of factories behind the Urals. And across the Atlantic, the United States was beginning to flex its industrial muscles. The statistics from 1940 and 1941 paint a damning picture of this decision. In 1940, Great Britain, a nation with half the population of Greater Germany and fighting for its life, actually produced more aircraft and tanks than Germany did. Let that sink in. The invincible German war machine was being outproduced by a besieged island because the German leadership refused to switch to a total war economy. They were fighting a 20th century war with a 19th century cottage industry mindset. This failure was compounded by the chaotic management of the German economy. There was no central figure coordinating production. Instead, it was a feudal system of competing warlords. Hermann Göring, in charge of the 4-year plan, was incompetent and corrupt, more interested in stealing art than managing steel quotas. The different branches of the military, the Army, the Navy, and the Luftwaffe, fought each other for resources like starving dogs. The Army would order 1,000 trucks, but the Luftwaffe would hoard the aluminum needed to build them. The Navy would demand steel for U-boats that the Army needed for tanks. There was no standardization. German factories were producing hundreds of different types of vehicles, each requiring different spare parts. It was a logistical nightmare. They were building Rolls-Royces when they needed Model Ts. They focused on craftsmanship and over-engineering, treating every tank as a unique work of art rather than a disposable tool of war. The decision to maintain a peacetime economy during wartime meant that when the invasion of the Soviet Union began in 1941, the Wehrmacht was a one-shot weapon. It had a hard diamond tip of modern panzer divisions, but the shaft of the spear was made of rotten wood. Behind the tanks, the logistics were powered by horses, hundreds of thousands of them. The infantry marched on foot. The reserves of ammunition and fuel were dangerously low, calculated only for a short summer campaign. Hitler and his economists believed they could sustain the war by looting. They thought they could feed the German army and the German population with Ukrainian wheat and fuel the tanks with Caucasian oil. They viewed the conquered territories as a supermarket where everything was free. But an economy based on plunder is unsustainable. You can steal a loaf of bread only once. To fight a global war of attrition against the combined GDP of the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and the United States, you need to produce not just steel. By the time the snow began to fall outside Moscow in late 1941, the consequences of the 1940 decision were becoming catastrophically clear. The German tanks, halted by the mud and the cold, were breaking down, and when the generals called Berlin for replacements, the cupboard was bare. There were no massive reserves of tanks waiting on train cars. There were no mountains of winter clothing. There was only the output of a peacetime economy that was struggling to ramp up. The decision to prioritize butter over guns in 1940 bought Hitler domestic popularity in the short term, but it mortgaged the future of the Reich. It meant that when the war turned from a sprint into a marathon, Germany was already out of breath. They had broken their own machine before the real fighting had even started, assuming that willpower could replace horsepower. They were about to learn, in the harshest way possible, that in modern warfare, the factory floor is just as important as a battlefield. On the dawn of June 22, 1941, the German Wehrmacht launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in the history of warfare. 3 million men surged across the border into the Soviet Union, a tidal wave of steel and fire that seemed destined to sweep away everything in its path. To the observer, this looked like the apex of military power. But if you stripped away the propaganda and looked at the ledger books in Berlin, you would see that this was not an army prepared for a war conquest. It was an army prepared for a looting expedition. The decision to keep the German economy on a peacetime footing meant that the soldiers marching east were walking a tightrope over an abyss, with no safety net beneath them. If you want to understand how the greatest gamble in history was lost before the first shot was fired, verify that you're subscribed to our channel, because we are about to expose the logistical suicide of the Third Reich. The fundamental flaw of the German war machine in 1941 was a lack of depth. Because of the decision to prioritize consumer comfort over total mobilization, the Wehrmacht attacked with barely enough reserves to last 3 months. The supply depots were not overflowing with spare engines, winter tracks, or replacement battalions. They were dangerously empty. The strategic calculation was terrifyingly simple. The Soviet Union had to collapse before the first snow fell, or Germany would face disaster. This was not a war of strategy. It was a war of accounting, and the Germans had cooked the books. They had underestimated the enemy's industrial capacity by a magnitude that borders on delusion. German intelligence estimated that the Soviet Union could field perhaps 200 divisions. They believed the Soviet industry was primitive and brittle. But while Germany had been resting on its laurels in 1940, the Soviet Union had been preparing for the apocalypse. As the German panzers smashed through the frontier, the Soviets pulled off one of the greatest industrial miracles of the 20th century. Under the ruthless direction of the State Defense Committee, they dismantled over 1,500 factories in the western USSR, taking them apart bolt by bolt, loaded them onto thousands of trains, and shipped them east beyond the Ural Mountains. There, in the freezing wilderness, workers, often women and children, rebuilt the factories in weeks. They laid concrete floors on the frozen ground and started producing tanks before the roofs were even on the buildings. While German factories were still operating on single shifts, producing high-quality goods with a craftsman's pace, Soviet factories were running 24 hours a day, churning out the T-34 tank. The T-34 was the physical embodiment of the difference between the two economies. The German Panzer III and IV were engineering marvels, comfortable for the crew, with sophisticated optics and radios. But they were complex, expensive, and slow to build. The T-34 was rough. The welding was sloppy. The transmission required a hammer to shift gears. It lacked creature comforts. But it was lethal, it was rugged, and crucially, it was designed for mass production. By late 1941, the disparity in production philosophy began to bleed the Wehrmacht dry. When a German panzer division lost a tank to a mine or a mechanical breakdown, there was no replacement waiting at the railhead. The tank was gone forever. The divisions began to shrink. A panzer division that started the campaign with 150 tanks would be down to 50 tanks within weeks. The German army was melting away like a block of ice in the summer sun. Conversely, the Red Army, despite losing tens of thousands of tanks in the opening battles, seemed to regenerate like a hydra. For every tank the Germans destroyed, the factories in the Urals produced 2 more. The German generals at the front were baffled. They wrote home in despair, asking, were they getting all these tanks? The answer lay in the decision Germany had made to not mobilize. They were fighting a math problem they couldn't solve. Then came the crisis of the winter of 1941. We often blame the general winter, the snow and the cold, for stopping the German army at the gates of Moscow. But the cold was only the executioner. The judge and jury was the broken supply chain. The German logistics system collapsed not just because of the mud, but because the economy back home hadn't produced the necessary infrastructure. The locomotives of the Deutsche Reichsbahn froze solid because they hadn't been winterized. Why? Because the production plan didn't account for a winter campaign. The soldiers froze in their summer uniforms because the textile industry hadn't been ordered to switch to winter gear until it was too late. There were thousands of tons of winter clothing sitting in depots in Poland, but there were no trains to move them because the rail network was prioritized for ammunition and fuel. The entire system was gridlocked. It was a chaotic scramble for resources caused by a lack of central planning. Fritz Todt, the Minister of Armaments and Munitions before Albert Speer, saw the writing on the wall. He was the one man who looked at the production figures and had the courage to tell Hitler the truth. In November 1941, returning from a freezing front lines, Todt reportedly told the Führer, "This war can no longer be won by military means. It must be ended politically." Todt realized that the German economy was incapable of sustaining a war of attrition against the Soviet Union. The rate of consumption on the Eastern Front was simply higher than the rate of production in the Reich. Germany was firing shells faster than it could make them. It was burning fuel faster than it could refine it. It was losing men faster than it could train them. And then, in December 1941, the nightmare scenario became reality. The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and Hitler, in a fit of strategic madness, declared war on the United States. The decision of 1940 now came back to haunt Germany with a vengeance. They were no longer just fighting the British Empire and the Soviet Union. They were now at war with the world's largest industrial power. The entry of the United States changed the metric of the war entirely. American industry was not just mobilized, it was unleashed. The U.S. automobile industry alone had a greater potential output than the entire German economy. Hitler dismissed the Americans as a decadent culture of razor blades and radios, incapable of building military hardware. He was fatally wrong. While Germany was still debating how to allocate steel between the Army and the Navy, the United States was building the Pentagon, the Manhattan Project, and the Liberty Ship program simultaneously. The sheer volume of material that began to flow from the arsenal of democracy was incomprehensible to the German leadership. By the end of 1941, the German war machine was effectively broken. It would continue to fight for 3.5 more years, fueled by fanaticism, tactical brilliance, and the inertia of a great power. But strategically, it was a walking corpse. The one-shot army had taken its shot at Moscow and missed. Now, it was stuck in a grinding war of attrition with a broken industrial base, facing enemies who were outproducing it by a factor of 10 to 1. The illusion of efficiency was shattered, revealing the chaotic, futile mess of the Nazi economy underneath. On a freezing morning in February 1942, a Heinkel bomber exploded in a ball of fire shortly after taking off from the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia. Inside the wreckage lay the charred body of Fritz Todt, the Reich Minister of Armaments. With his death, the one man who had dared to tell Hitler that the war was economically lost was silenced. Whether it was an accident or an assassination remains one of history's dark mysteries. But the immediate consequence was undeniable. It cleared the stage for the entrance of a new character. Adolf Hitler turned to his favorite architect, a man who had never managed a factory in his life, and handed him the keys to the entire German war economy. That man was Albert Speer. This transition marks the moment Germany finally attempted to wake up from its delusion. But as we will see, waking up while a house is already on fire is rarely enough to save it. If you are intrigued by the dark intersection of genius, ambition, and total moral collapse, make sure you are subscribed to our channel, because we are about to analyze the so-called Speer miracle. When Albert Speer walked into the Ministry of Armaments, he found a system that was functionally insane. It is a common myth that the Nazi state was a monolith of efficiency. In reality, it was a chaotic feudal system where overlapping bureaucracies fought for power. The army had its own factories. The SS was building its own industrial empire using concentration camp labor, and Hermann Göring was hoarding steel for a Luftwaffe that was losing the war in the skies. Speer discovered that German industry was still operating on a peacetime mentality. Factories were running single shifts. If a machine broke down, the workers went home. There was no standardization. For example, the German army was using over 150 different types of motorcycles and dozens of different truck models. Each required its own specific spare parts. This meant that a supply truck on the Eastern Front might be carrying carburetors that fit only 10% of the vehicles in the division. It was a logistical suicide pact. Speer's solution was ruthless pragmatism. He implemented industrial self-responsibility. He kicked the military officers out of factories. He told the generals, "You tell us what you need, a tank that shoots 2,000 meters and drives 50 kilometers an hour. Do not tell us how to build it." He handed control back to the industrialists and engineers, the men who actually knew how to run assembly lines. He forced the different companies to share secrets. Before Speer, a company like Mercedes-Benz would hide its patents from a competitor like MAN. Speer told them that if they didn't share their blueprints to increase efficiency, he would shut them down. He standardized everything. He reduced the number of truck models from 151 to 23. He demanded mass production techniques similar to what Henry Ford was doing in America. The results were statistically staggering. In just 6 months, ammunition production rose by 97%. Tank production rose by 25%. Gun production rose by 60%. By the middle of 1943, Germany was producing twice as many weapons as it had in 1941. Historians call this the armaments miracle. On paper, it looked like Germany had pulled a rabbit out of a hat. It looked like the decision of 1940 had been reversed. But statistics in war can be deceiving. While Speer was doubling German production, the Allies were quadrupling theirs. The United States was launching a Liberty ship every single day. The Soviet Union was launching AT-34 tank every 30 minutes. Germany was running a race where they were sprinting faster than ever before, but their opponents were driving race cars. The gap wasn't closing, it was widening. Furthermore, this miracle came with a horrific price tag that would stain the German soul forever: the shortage of German labor, because the men were dying at the front, was solved by the mass enslavement of Europe. Speer worked closely with Fritz Sauckel, the plenipotentiary for labor deployment, to drag millions of people from France, Poland, Ukraine, and the Netherlands into the factories. These weren't just workers. They were human capital to be consumed. In the underground factories and synthetic oil plants, slave laborers were worked to death on a diet of watery turnip soup. The efficiency of the German war machine in these years was lubricated by the blood of millions. It was a moral abyss. The war machine was no longer just fighting for the regime. It was consuming the very people it had conquered to sustain itself for a few more months. And there was another factor that made Speer's efforts futile: the strategic bomber. Just as German industry began to hum with efficiency, the Royal Air Force and the U.S. Army Air Forces began their combined bomber offensive. The 1,000 bomber raids on Cologne, Hamburg, and the Ruhr Valley didn't just kill civilians. They disrupted the delicate web of supply chain Speer had created. A tank factory might be working at 100% efficiency, but if the ball bearing factory in Schweinfurt was flattened by B-17s, the tanks couldn't be finished. If the synthetic rubber plant was bombed, the trucks had no tires. Speer found himself playing a giant game of whack-a-mole. He was constantly moving factories underground, dispersing production into forests and caves. The survival tactic kept production going, but it added friction to the system. It made everything slower, harder, and more desperate. The tragedy of the Speer miracle is that it proved what the German economy could have done if it had been mobilized in 1940. If these production numbers had been achieved before the invasion of Russia, history might have looked very different. The tanks produced in 1943 were technically superior, the Tigers and the Panthers, but they were arriving on a battlefield where the strategic initiative had already been lost. In late 1942 and early 1943, the twin disasters of El Alamein and Stalingrad struck. These defeats wiped out entire armies. The material losses were staggering. The 6th Army of Stalingrad alone lost the equivalent of 6 months of production. Speer was pouring water into a bucket that had a massive hole in the bottom. No matter how much he increased production, the rate of destruction at the front was accelerating. The decision of 1940, the decision to relax, to loot, to underestimate, had created a time debt that could not be repaid. In war, time is the one resource you cannot manufacture. You can build synthetic oil, you can synthesize rubber, but you cannot synthesize the year 1941. By 1943, the German war machine was a zombie. It looked formidable. It was still killing thousands of Allied soldiers. It was churning out weapons at a record pace, but it was structurally unsound. It was relying on slave labor, fighting under skies controlled by the enemy, and facing a coalition of powers that had economically eclipsed it. The machine was running hot, redlining the engine, screaming toward a cliff edge that everyone in the leadership could see, but no one dared to mention. The miracle was just a delay of the inevitable execution. By the spring of 1944, the Third Reich presented a paradox that baffled Allied intelligence. Despite the relentless bombing of German cities, despite the retreat from Russia, and despite the loss of North Africa, German factories were churning out more weapons than ever before. Albert Speer's miracle was hitting its peak. Trainloads of Tiger tanks, Panther tanks, and Focke-Wulf fighters were rolling out of the underground assembly lines. On paper, the German war machine looked deadlier than it had been in 1940. But machine is more than just gears and steel. It needs blood to function. And in the mechanical heart of the Wehrmacht, the blood was running dry. The decision to neglect the development of a robust, redundant energy supply had finally caught up with the regime. The war machine didn't die from a lack of bullets. It died from a cardiac arrest caused by a lack of oil. If you want to understand the exact moment a superpower becomes powerless, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell, because we are about to watch the fuel gauge hit empty. To understand this collapse, we must look at the sky over Germany in May 1944. For years, the Allied bomber commanders, Arthur Bomber Harris of the RAF and Carl Spaatz of the USAF, had argued over strategy. Harris wanted to flatten cities to break morale. The Americans wanted to hit specific factories. But in May, a new target was selected, one that terrified Albert Speer more than any other: the synthetic oil plants. Germany has almost no natural oil reserves. It relied heavily on the oil fields of Ploesti in Romania, and even more critically, on a complex network of chemical plants like the giant Luna works, which turned coal into liquid fuel. These plants were the Achilles heel of the entire Nazi war effort. They were massive, fragile, and impossible to move underground. On May 12, 1944, the U.S. 8th Air Force launched a massive raid against these oil refineries. When Speer saw the damage reports, he reportedly told Hitler, "The enemy has struck us at one of our weakest points. If they persist this time, we will soon have no fuel production worth mentioning." The Allies did persist. They hammered the oil plants day after day. The results were immediate and catastrophic. In April 1944, German aviation fuel production was 175,000 tons. By July, It had crashed to 30,000 tons. By September, it was 5,000 tons. The Luftwaffe, the once proud eagle that had terrorized Europe, was effectively grounded. This is where the tragedy of the production miracle becomes a dark comedy. Speer was producing thousands of new fighter planes. The Bf-109s and Fw-190s were piling up on airstrips. But there was no fuel to fly them. And even worse, there was no fuel to train new pilots. In 1944, a young American pilot arrived in Europe with 150 hours of flight training. His German counterpart was being sent into combat with barely 10 or 15 hours of flight time. Why? Because the Luftwaffe could not afford to burn gasoline on training flights. They were sending teenagers up in complex machines to be slaughtered by Allied aces. The German air defense collapsed not for a lack of planes, but for a lack of competence, driven by a lack of fuel. On the ground, the situation was even more pathetic. The mighty Panzer divisions, the symbols of Blitzkrieg, were reduced to static pillboxes. A Tiger tank consumes gallons of fuel just to start its engine. Without gas, a 60-ton tank is just a block of steel. In the final year of the war, countless German tanks were abandoned on the side of the road, fully armed, perfectly functional, but completely dry. Crews were ordered to destroy their own vehicles and retreat on foot. The Wehrmacht went from being the most mobile army in history to an army that moved at the speed of an ox cart. In fact, by 1944, the German army was using more horses for logistics than it had in 1914. While the fuel crisis was strangling the army, the German leadership made another fatal decision: the retreat into fantasy. Instead of focusing on practical solutions to prolong the defensive war, Hitler and his inner circle became obsessed with Wunderwaffen, wonder weapons. They believed that technology could overcome logistics. This led to the diversion of critical resources into projects that were scientifically brilliant but strategically useless. The most famous examples are the V-1 flying bomb and the V-2 rocket. The V-2 was the world's first ballistic missile, a technological marvel that touched the edge of space. But as a weapon of war, it was a disaster. The V-2 program consumed more money and resources than the Manhattan Project did for the Americans. It required thousands of tons of potatoes to distill the alcohol for its fuel, potatoes that were desperately needed to feed the starving population. And what was the result? The V-2 warhead carried less explosive than a conventional bomber, could drop in a single pass. It killed a few thousand civilians in London and Antwerp, but it didn't hit a single military target of value. It didn't stop a single Allied tank. It was a spectacular waste of energy, purely for the sake of vengeance. Then there was the Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. It was 100 miles per hour faster than anything the Allies had. It could have devastated the American bomber formations. But it came too late, and it was mishandled. Hitler, in his obsession with offensive weapons, initially demanded the jet be used as a bomber, stripping it of its speed advantage. By the time it was deployed as a fighter, the engines were failing because the specialized metals needed to build them were no longer available. This technological hubris was a final symptom of a broken system. The German leadership was looking for a magic bullet to save them from the consequences of their 1940 economic decisions. They were building Ferraris to fight a demolition derby against thousands of bulldozers. The American Sherman tank and the Soviet T-34 were inferior to the German Panther one-on-one, but there were always 10 of them for every one German. And crucially, the Allied tanks had gas tanks that were full. The collapse of the transportation network was the final blow. The Allied transportation plan targeted the railway yards and bridges. With the Luftwaffe grounded due to a lack of fuel, Allied fighter bombers roamed the skies over Germany with impunity. They shot at anything that moved. Trains carrying coal could not reach the power plants. Trains carrying bauxite could not reach the aluminum factories. The economy began to compartmentalize. A factory in Bavaria might have finished parts, but couldn't ship them to the assembly plant in Berlin. Germany was being strangled. The war machine was no longer a machine. It was a collection of isolated, starving organs, twitching in the death throes. The decision to start a global war, without securing a global supply of energy, had finally come due. The tanks were fresh from the factory. The paint was still wet. The guns were sighted, but the engines were silent. And silence in war is the sound of defeat. In the autumn of 1944, the Third Reich was no longer fighting a war. It was participating in a national suicide pact. The borders were crumbling. The Red Army was standing on the Vistula, gazing at the spires of Warsaw. The Western Allies had liberated Paris and were pushing toward the Rhine. Yet, in this moment of absolute catastrophe, the Nazi leadership did not surrender. Instead, they made the final, gruesome calculation of the war. Having exhausted their supply of iron, oil, and rubber, they decided to feed the war machine with the only resource left, the flesh and blood of their own population. The decision of 1940, to protect the German people from the hardships of war, had come full circle. Now, the regime would consume those very people to buy itself a few more weeks of existence. If you want to witness the tragedy of a nation devouring its own future to save a dying past, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications, because we are entering the darkest chapter of collapse. To understand this final phase, we must look at the demographic disaster that Germany had inflicted upon itself. Because the leadership had refused to fully mobilize the economy in the early years, they had also refused to mobilize the workforce. While British and American women were riveting airplane wings and driving trucks, German women were largely kept at home, encouraged to be mothers and housewives in accordance with Nazi ideology. By late 1944, this policy had created a fatal labor shortage. With millions of men dead or captured on the Eastern Front, the factories were empty. Albert Speer, in desperation, began to scour the factories for able-bodied men to send to the front lines. He was stripping the skilled engineers and mechanics, the very men who knew how to build the tanks, and handing them rifles. It was a death spiral. You take the man making the machine gun and send him to shoot the machine gun, ensuring that soon there will be no one left to make the replacement. In October 1944, the regime officially formed the Volkssturm, or People's Storm. This was a militia of the desperate. Old men up to the age of 60 and boys as young as 16, and often younger, were conscripted to defend the Reich. They were dragged from their homes, given an armband, and handed a Panzerfaust, a disposable anti-tank weapon. Most had no uniforms. Many had no rifles. They were told to stop the T-34s and Sherman tanks with nothing but fanaticism. The creation of the Volkssturm was the ultimate admission that the war machine was broken. A professional army protects its civilians. A dying tyranny uses its civilians as sandbags. The sight of gray-haired veterans of World War I standing alongside terrified Hitler Youth teenagers in muddy trenches was a physical manifestation of the strategic bankruptcy caused by the decisions of 1940. But even as the society collapsed, the ghost of the German military had one last gasp left. Adolf Hitler, living in a world of maps that no longer reflected reality, ordered a massive counteroffensive in the West. Operation Watch on the Rhine, better known as the Battle of the Bulge. This operation, launched in December 1944, is a perfect case study of why the German war machine failed. Albert Speer, through miracles of improvisation, and by hoarding meager supplies, managed to equip the Panzer armies one last time. He scraped together the last reserves of fuel. He delivered hundreds of new Tiger II and Panther tanks to the Ardennes forests. It was an impressive feat of logistics, but it was strategically insane. The plan required the German tanks to advance over 100 miles to capture the Allied port of Antwerp. But the tanks only had enough fuel for 50 miles. The entire operation relied on the assumption that they would capture American fuel dumps along the way. Think about that. The mighty German army, once the master of logistics, was launching its final offensive with a plan that amounted to armed robbery for gas money. When the offensive began, it achieved tactical surprise. The Americans were pushed back, but the laws of physics and economics asserted themselves. The German columns, massive and fuel-hungry, got stuck in traffic jams on the narrow, icy roads. When they ran out of gas, the crews didn't fight to the death. They simply climbed out of their million-mark war machines and walked back to Germany. The Battle of the Bulge didn't change the outcome of the war. It accelerated the end. It burned through the last reserves of men and equipment that Speer had painfully assembled. It left the Western Front defenseless, and more critically, it stripped the Eastern Front of the armor needed to stop the inevitable Soviet winter offensive. It was a final all-in bet of a gambler who had already lost his house. Back in the cities, the infrastructure was disintegrating. The Allied bombing campaign against the transportation network had finally paralyzed the country. It wasn't just that factories were being bombed. It was that the coal couldn't get from the Ruhr Valley to the power plants. By January 1945, the German economy was compartmentalizing. The grid was down. A factory in Saxony might have electricity, but no raw materials. A factory in Bavaria might have steel, but no coal to heat the furnaces. The mesmerizing efficiency of the German railway system, the Reichsbahn, was reduced to a series of disconnected local lines. Albert Speer, driving through the ruined landscape, realized that the war was over. He began to travel around Germany, not to spur production, but to sabotage Hitler's final orders. Hitler, in his nihilistic rage, had issued the Nero Decree, officially the Demolitions on Reich Territory Decree. He ordered that all industrial plants, bridges, railways, and communication stations be destroyed. If the war is lost, Hitler declared, the nation will also perish. Speer spent the final months of the war playing a dangerous double game. He issued counterorders. He pleaded with generals and Gauleiters to leave the bridges standing and the factories intact, arguing that the German people would need them to survive after the defeat. It was the final irony. The man who had built the war machine was now frantically trying to prevent the leadership from smashing what was left of it. The machine was no longer producing for victory. It was producing for the apocalypse. The V-2 rockets continued to fall on London, killing civilians but having zero military impact. The jet fighters sat on airfields, grounded by lack of kerosene, waiting to be strafed by American Mustangs. The Volkssturm boys dug anti-tank ditches that the Allied bulldozers would fill in minutes. The decision of 1940 to fight a limited war had mutated into a total war of self-destruction. The regime had proven incapable of managing a modern industrial conflict, so it retreated into a Wagnerian fantasy of glorious death. But there is no glory in a factory that has stopped humming or a tank that has no fuel. There is only silence and rust. As the winter of 1945 turned to spring, the silence grew louder. The great industrial heart of Europe, the Ruhr, was encircled. The Silesian coal mines were captured by the Soviets. The war machine, starved of energy materials and men, finally gave a shuddering gasp and died. But the dying wasn't over yet. The corpse of the machine was still armed, and it would drag the world through a few more months of hell before the final surrender. In late April 1945, a strange and terrifying silence began to descend over the heart of Europe. For 6 years, the continent had echoed with the roar of engines, the scream of sirens, and the thunder of artillery. But now, in the ruins of the Thousand-Year Reich, the noise was dying out. It wasn't just that the soldiers were surrendering. It was that the machines themselves were expiring. On the roads leading out of Berlin, King Tiger tanks, the most fearsome armored vehicles ever built, sat silent and abandoned, not because they had been destroyed by enemy fire, but because their fuel gauges read empty. They were steel monuments to a failed strategy. The German war machine did not end with a glorious final charge. It ended with a dry-fuel tank and a silent factory. If you want to understand the true cost of hubris and the lessons that history teaches us about the economics of survival, make sure you are subscribed to our channel and have clicked that bell, because this is a final accounting of the decision that broke Germany. In the Führer bunker, beneath the burning streets of Berlin, the disconnect between reality and the decision of 1940 reached its tragic climax. Adolf Hitler, trembling and gray, spent his final days moving imaginary armies across a map. He ordered General Wenck's 12th Army to turn around and save Berlin. He ordered the Luftwaffe to sweep the skies clear. He ordered the SS to scorch the earth. But these orders disappeared into the void. General Wenck's army was a ragged collection of survivors with no ammunition. The Luftwaffe had no jet fuel. The SS had no explosives left to blow the bridges. The command structure had disintegrated because the logistical spine that held it together had snapped. The dictator was pulling levers that were no longer connected to any machinery. The surrender of the Ruhr pocket earlier in April was the true symbol of the end. Field Marshal Walter Model, a fanatical Nazi commander, found himself encircled with over 300,000 men, the remnants of Army Group B. In 1940 or 1941, an army of this size would have fought for weeks. In 1945, they surrendered en masse. Why? Because they had literally nothing left to fight with. The interrogation reports of German officers from this period are telling. They didn't complain about the fighting spirit of their men. They complained that they had been sent to war with a logistics system that belonged in the 19th century. When the Allied technical teams, the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, entered Germany in the wake of the armies, they began to interview the industrial managers. They spoke to the men who ran the steel mills and the chemical plants. What they found shocked them. They discovered that for the first 2 years of the war, German industry had been operating at a fraction of its capacity. They found factories that had been running on a single 8-hour shift all the way until 1942. They found vast stockpiles of luxury goods that had been produced while the army was begging for winter coats. They concluded that if Germany had fully mobilized its economy in 1940, if they had adopted the total war footing of Britain or the USSR immediately after the fall of France, they could have produced an extra 20,000 tanks and 10,000 aircraft before the invasion of Russia even began. Imagine the Eastern Front with an additional 20,000 Panzer IVs. Imagine the Battle of Britain with an additional 5,000 Messerschmitts. It is a terrifying what if. It suggests that Germany had the industrial potential to perhaps force a stalemate, or at least prolong the war significantly. But that potential was squandered by the political decision to keep the German people comfortable. By the time they tried to flip the switch with the Spear miracle, the strategic bombing campaign, and the loss of territory made it impossible to catch up. The legacy of this failure is not just military. It is a lesson in the danger of short-termism. The Nazi leadership bet everything on a short war because they were afraid to pay the price of a long one. They treated the economy like a credit card, maxing it out on the blitzkrieg, assuming they could pay the bill with the loot from conquered nations. But when the bill finally came due at Stalingrad and Normandy, they were bankrupt. We also see the failure of the wonder weapon mentality. In the final assessment, the German war machine was destroyed by its own obsession with quality over quantity. The German engineers built the best tanks in the world. The Tiger and the King Tiger were masterpieces, but they were over-engineered, difficult to repair, and impossible to mass-produce. While German engineers were arguing over the perfect transmission for a tank that would break down after 100 miles anyway, the Americans were building the Sherman. The Sherman was inferior in firepower and armor, but it worked. It started every time. And if it broke, you could fix it with a wrench. The Soviets built the T-34 with rough welds and uncomfortable seats, but they built 50,000 of them. The German decision to pursue technological perfection came at the expense of strategic utility. They forgot that in a war of attrition, good enough is often better than perfect, especially if perfect is rare. On May 8, 1945, the guns finally fell silent. The unconditional surrender was signed. The Third Reich, which claimed it would last 1,000 years, had lasted 12. It left behind a continent in ruins and a generation of young men buried in shallow graves from the Volga to the Rhine. As the dust settled, the stunned no, hour zero, began. The German people emerged from their cellars to face a world where their industrial might had been reduced to rubble. The factories that Albert Speer had frantically tried to keep running were twisted skeletons of steel. The synthetic oil plants were smoking craters. The logistical network was obliterated. But the final irony is that the true breaking of the machine happened long before the bombs started falling. It happened in the conference rooms of Berlin in 1940. It happened when Hitler, Göring, and the High Command decided that they could win a world war without fighting a total war. It happened when they decided that the comfort of the home front was more important than the readiness of the front line. They broke their own machine by refusing to fuel it with the necessary urgency until it was too late. They underestimated the resolve of democracies and the industrial capacity of the Soviet state. They believed their own propaganda that will and racial superiority could overcome the hard math of production and logistics. The history of World War II is often told through maps and battles, through the genius of generals and the bravery of soldiers. But ultimately, the war was won and lost in the ledgers of production managers. The decision that broke Germany's war machine was a decision to treat war as a limited venture rather than an existential struggle. It serves as a timeless reminder that in the unforgiving calculus of global conflict, you cannot cheat the math. You cannot buy victory on the cheap. And if you wait until the enemy is at the gates to start building your defenses, you have already lost. Thank you for watching this deep dive into the economic and strategic history of the Second World War. We hope this series has given you a new perspective on how the mighty Wehrmacht was dismantled from the inside out. If you enjoyed this analysis, please like the video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more documentaries that go beyond the battlefield. Until next time, remember that history is in the details.